Imagine a world where everyone was beautiful, where everyone was athletic, where everyone was intelligent, and where everyone was talented. A society so advanced that nothing could stand in its way. But how would this all begin?
You could design your baby's features, would you?
It could wipe out some diseases such as Down syndrome, but it could lead to designer babies.
Build-A-Bear. Well, what about Build-A-Baby?
That you can pick out height, gender, eye color, hair color.
Taste for a particular child or a preference for a particular child.
Now this clinic plans to allow parents to select physical traits.
Genetic modification in embryos is a scientific breakthrough that will be dominating the scientific community in the 21st century. This allows scientists to potentially design what a baby will be like by altering DNA. These designer babies would be screened for genetic diseases, gender, physical characteristics, and possibly personality traits. This could be potentially beneficial by reducing the occurrence of disease in the neonate. It all sounds great at a glance, but a deeper look reveals a startling conflict. Is the expense of designer babies really worth the results? By creating a superhuman race, would we create a homogeneous population? Would it be ethically moral to alter your own kids? Are there alternatives for improvement? Or is genetic modification our only resort?
So when talking about doing genetic modification to the DNA of embryos, I would say that my position is against it, with perhaps an exception for genetic modifications that would prevent life-threatening mutations.
Now, if you're going to say I want my child to have blue eyes, brown eyes, no, I'm totally against that. Absolutely, totally against it.
If you're talking about choosing characteristics such as gender or hair color or eye color or making prettier babies or smarter babies, I would be opposed to that. If you're talking about genetically modifying a gene for cystic fibrosis so that someone who had that gene would become would end up with a normal gene instead of a cystic fibrosis gene, I think that that kind of research is warranted and it could be beneficial.
I am against genetically modified babies because there are a lot of problems that come up when you start modifying babies in particular, because any changes that you make to babies will be passed on genetically to their offspring.
The most important aspect to keep in mind when thinking about genetic modification in human embryos is the moral implications. Is it ethically just to make modifications to your child? Some argue that it is ethical, that they're improving the lives of their children and providing them with the skills and appearance they need to succeed in life. That's what all loving parents want for their kids. But does being a parent give one the authority to decide a child's future?
Probably the most pressing ethical implication of designer babies is the fact that you would be altering a person without their consent. So almost everything we do medically and research-wise, if we're using a human to do it, it requires informed consent, which means you tell the individual exactly what they're doing and you have them agree that yes, they want this done to them. Well, you can't ask an embryo if it wants to be altered in any way.
The biggest ethical problem is self-determination. But I think part of having a child is getting to know them as they grow up, because you can't control that. I mean, you can control it to a point with how you raise them, but you can't really control who they turn out to be. And this, it's just my opinion that it seems wrong to craft every aspect of your child.
In most medical treatments, the patient is asked whether it consents to the surgery. However, you can't ask an embryo if it wants to have blue eyes or blonde hair. This goes against ethical guidelines of medicine if carried out. Critics argue that genetic modification is equivalent to playing God. God's creations are meant to be unique, each with its own fate. But if humans are attempting to create their own offspring, its fate would be in their hands.
An ethical problem is should you tamper with what God has created. There's many people who would believe that that's wrong to do.
As we delve further into the creation of genetically modified embryos, unintended consequences is an important factor to keep in mind. We, as humans, do not fully understand the complexities of the human genome. So if we tamper with a gene, we will not be certain whether the effect will be what we intended it to be.
Is the unintended consequences of what you're doing. We have incomplete knowledge. We have the ability now to insert genes, but we have incomplete knowledge as to how the expression of those genes might impact a person for their full life. So we might fix one thing and then end up causing problems in another area. And I think the unintended consequences could create whole new classifications of disease that we don't even have right now.
And those traits are, one, they're multi-component. So you have to find a lot of different genes to modify, and you may not even be able to increase it all that much, because we know, at least for IQ, 50% of IQ is environmental, 50% is genetic, so you'd only be increasing a portion of it if you could do that. Secondly, if you're looking for traits that impact, say, athletic ability as an example, you may target things like genes that increase muscle development, height, things like that. And if you start altering those, you may begin accidentally altering, when you alter certain genes that lead to a certain destiny along that pathway, okay, say taller, stronger, etc., you may be negatively impacting other components, because some of those genes feed into multiple pathways. And so while you may be increasing certain traits that you find desirable, you may also be impacting other traits you weren't intending to change, just because certain proteins are involved in multiple different developmental pathways.
We have to keep in mind the cost of genetic research in this certain area and whether or not the result is profitable. Technology available today is already very expensive for treatments such as pre-implantation diagnosis that ensure a successful pregnancy. So if you want to change an embryo's traits, it would cost significantly more. There's always a chance, however, that the treatment won't work.
So I think, like any technological advance, the day will probably come when such techniques will be available. My suspicion is that they will remain quite expensive for quite some time and will only be available to the richest percentages of the population who choose to utilize that technology.
Another negative consequence of designer babies would be the creation of a homogeneous population. This would be a society where everyone looked similar. Standards of beauty would be changed, and if you weren't modified, you wouldn't be beautiful.
What you're decreasing in diversity is intellectual capacity. So what you're wanting to do is maximize intellectual capacity. So you have fewer people with lower intellectual capacity. What you want to do is maximize physical health, physical strength, physical abilities, and therefore you would have fewer people who have physical disabilities have shortened lifespans. And so in that way, it would decrease diversity.
We may have a good idea on how developed nations like the US may use genetic modifications, but how will this technology affect traditional developing countries and their genetic diversity? Countries such as India and China are currently expanding rapidly both economically and population-wise. Driven by their traditional value of men over women, as many as 1,000 infant or young girls are either aborted or abandoned to make way for the boys. In India, men are a better investment over women because of their ability to make money in society, whereas women will eventually be shipped off for marriage while offering an expensive dowry to the groom. Currently, men outnumber women 1,000 male births to 933 female births in India. In China, with their one-child law, most families would prefer a male child, and many mothers will abort their daughters or place them in overflowing orphanages. If the option of choosing the gender of their children were to become widespread in these countries, what will become of girls?
But there's different cultures. Oh my gosh, there's different cultures in this world. They have got to have a boy,
Taking a look back at history, we can get a pretty clear sense about what happens when we try to make a super race. For example, Hitler. With his master plan of creating a perfect, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan race, he strived to make Nazi Germany the ideal society. However, we've seen how creating a master race could come with terrible consequences. Would America, land of the free, want to follow in the footsteps of Nazi Germany?
Plus, there's the fact that if everybody is trying to make their kids blonde, everybody's trying to make their kids tall, then we have, I don't know, that's kind of like making Hitler's dream come true, that everybody, looks the same, and it's this perfect master race.
Alternatives to genetic modification to cure illnesses are being used currently. The topic of designer babies is very controversial, and many ask whether we truly need to alter genes to improve life when we have been doing fine so far.
Designer babies are not necessary. Clearly we have had, our entire civilization has been without designer babies, and we continue to evolve and grow and advance.
The problem with designer babies, assuming we could isolate a gene for height, musical inclination, or whatever, which we may not be able to, because those things obviously aren't all genetic. But let's say if you could give your child the genes to be an amazing concert violinist, then not only would people who didn't have those genes be put at a severe disadvantage, but it would take the challenge out of it. And I think a lot of things in life, they're only worth it because you have to work for them.
Legislation has been passed in other countries to ban gender selection. For example, sex selection abortions have been banned in India for over a decade through the PNDT Act of 1994. These countries, like India, have taken a first step to avoid a homogeneous population.
As far as preventing it, I'm not sure what could be done other than potentially passing legislation, such as right now in the United States, it is illegal to clone yourself. So you could pass legislation that says it's illegal to manipulate an embryo for designer baby purposes, and it's possible that that kind of legislation could be passed.
If we allowed designer babies to spread throughout society, we'd be creating a world of supermen. A future of genetically superior beings would no longer be imaginary. It would become a reality. But is a world of supermen really what we need in society? We would be breaking down walls built by our ancestors and destroying what made us ultimately human, our imperfection. A superman in a super world would be meaningless. Hard work and self-made men would be lost. Is this really the world we want to live in?